bicentennial of the War of 1812, and the so-called experts are taking another look at that Treaty of Conciliation, which Monroe put together, which is there in London. And if you'd been able to get past a particularly Anglophobic President Jefferson, that treaty likely would have ended up in the hands of the Senate. The Senate likely would have ratified it, and we would not have had the War of 1812. But as it was, Monroe offended the wags of the Jefferson administration. They punished him. They sent Billy Pinckney from Maryland over there to London to give Monroe a kick in the derriere. Well, Pinckney came to the same conclusion Monroe did. And so those two boys reconfigured this Treaty of Conciliation, got it back to the President Jefferson. Oh no, I'm not even going to look at this treaty. And then Monroe got a terrible letter. You know, sometimes you can work as hard as you can for an immediate superior and you're still going to get a terrible letter. It came from Secretary of State Madison speaking for President Jefferson saying, "It appears, Mr. Monroe, that your mission to London has been a failure. Maybe you ought to come home, maybe you're recalled, maybe you're fired." So Monroe came home thoroughly fired for the second time in 10 years in 1807. Think about this for a moment. Is this not an extraordinary country, and a man can be fired by the first president of the United States, his former commander-in-chief, who given him a commendation for putting out of commission 2 Hessian 3-pounders at a critical point of the Battle of Trenton, which was a do-or-die battle to his nibs, General Washington of the nation. And then 10 years later to be fired by his closest neighbor and best friend, Mr. Jefferson, only to come home and get suckered into running for the presidency against Mr. Madison, and lose, and then to be thrown into the political wilderness from which he was never, ever, ever supposed to return. But he did, to eventually become the 5th President of the United States. Is there a message here? Not for any of you. You know the message. But in these hard times, you see, there's some people out there who've forgotten that we're Americans, and when we get knocked down, we get up again. When we get knocked down, we get up again. Now, we're going to have to get up because you're not even in the Monroe house yet. What? I've been listening to you all this time. I'm not even in the Monroe house yet. You're in the Monroe structure. They lived in this structure from 1799 to 1823. But after they left, in 1842, there was a fire which took that. Now, Colonel, why don't you bring your kitchens indoors? Don't you love that? Occasionally, Jefferson used his friends as guinea pigs. Now, that's a little hard. You know, when you saw that first pavilion up there at Monticello, it had a kitchen down below. So Monroe went ahead and fire steps to the middle of the gallery. And you see the lone green door there. Now, we've been talking about a winter tour, you see, rather a winter visit. At the end of that 3rd week in the winter, something would happen. That green door would get a code name. It would be called the Mercy Door, because the Monroes, having assessed the negative impact of the clucking upon their guests, realized that something had to be done to improve morale before these guests went home. You can improve morale with the right food at the right place at the right time. And so they would say to the servants with the food going through the Mercy Door, "Now don't go to the right, because that'll take you to the dining room," always requiring high protocol and good manners. "Go to the left to the relaxed room." They lived in a village all of their own about 2,000 yards west of the main house. And shame on us with all that structural work out there. We have failed to do the archaeological work we need to do to find a voice for those people. We do have a voice of sorts for the second group. They were the artisans. They were the ones who built everything on this farm. That White House was built completely by slave labor under a slave. They're coming under a slave foreman. But obviously, not all the structural work was done at one time, and that gave Monroe's farm manager, in the absence of Colonel Monroe, a chance to make a little extra dough for himself. He would lease out some of the slaves in this category to outlying farms until they would need it again. But if he did that, he still had to comply with the Black Code of Virginia, which said no slave in this category could be leased out anywhere without special transit papers and without a list of his skills. And if a slave has learned to read and write, you may say, surely those are useful skills. Yes, they are, but they were frightening skills for the master class. Because if you've got a young man and he can read and he can write and he can organize, then he can put together a slave revolt. And that's precisely what Governor Monroe confronted on the last day of August of 1800. A slave by the name of Gabriel Prosser had organized 275 slaves about ready to go into Richmond proper.